to begin academic events like this by acknowledging and paying respect to the Aboriginal or Indigenous people on whose ancestral territory we are meeting, and sometimes by speaking a sentence or two in the Indigenous language. Now, as good Germans who may have read about or watched Winnetou as you were growing up, I'm sure you approve of this Canadian custom. But I was thinking about it in relation to our event today, which takes place on what has been the territory of the German people for well over 1,000 years. Yet we hold this event in English, a foreign language, for the simple, regrettable reason that I am not fluent in German. I want, therefore, especially on this day after a very exciting German election, to acknowledge and pay respect to the German people, and to say in German a sentence taught to me long ago by a great lady, originally from Berlin, whom I hired as a secretary. It's a great Zitat from Immanuel Kant. Der Himmel hat den Menschen als Gegengewicht gegen die vielen Mühseligkeiten des Lebens 3 Dinge gegeben: die Hoffnung, den Schlaf und das Lachen. Now, when Aaron first emailed me 2.5 years ago, I was delighted at the prospect of lecturing about mobbing in this particular academic setting. The delays occasioned by COVID-19 and the frustrations of meeting virtually rather than face-to-face have not diminished my delight. This is because from 1950 to 1973, the Max Planck Society was the academic home of Nobel laureate Konrad Lorenz, who more than anybody began the scientific study of mobbing and entrenched the word mobbing in the vocabularies of many languages through his research on collective aggression in birds. I'm grateful to Professor Schumann, her fellow directors Gilles Laurent and Moritz Helmsteder, also to Dr. Irina Epstein and the administrative staff for planning this lecture with care and grace over these many months, giving thoughtful attention even to such details as the poster with Picasso's wrenching image of the weeping woman. I'm just a little concerned today that my voice is out of practice speaking loud for many minutes, and so may fail me during this lecture. If so, I will speak softly and would ask you just to raise the volume on your computer. And now I'm going to turn myself, if I can, into a small talking head in the corner of the screen. Is that all right now? Yes? You can see the slide?
Yes, yes, we can.
So
Thank you.
I want you to more easily follow this lecture with the aid of some PowerPoint slides. Now, you can't use the chat here during the lecture, but please be active and also responsive listeners, and maybe just pencil a note to yourself any question or comment or objections so that we can have some dialogue when the floor is open for feedback. Now, in my research on mobbing in academic workplaces, I stand on the shoulders of 3 German scholarly giants. Konrad Lorenz is the first. He not only named the essential social process, he elaborated an empirically true and balanced understanding of us human beings as combinations of nature and culture, instincts and learning, evolution and history, genetic architecture and surprise. I have rooted my scholarship in such a perspective, much in contrast to the radical social constructionism of Lorenz's critics like Ashley Montagu, who see humans as essentially plastic blank slates, emancipated from instincts, unconstrained by genetic and other natural realities. Further lesson from Lorenz is that science is a mental posture that may require not only statistics and lab experiments, but also, as in his case, living with your subject matter, being a participant observer, getting goose manure on your boots. The second German scholarly giant I must mention is the psychologist Heinz Lima, who grew up in Wolfenbüttel, but made his career in Sweden. The mobbing Lorenz had studied mainly among birds, Lehmann observed among human adults in their working lives. Lehmann coined the term workplace mobbing about 1980 and studied this form of collective aggression until his death in 1999. I have built my scholarship on Lehmann's more than on the related but contrasting literature on workplace bullying, a term coined by BBC journalist Andrea Adams in 1988 and popularized in the United States by Gary and Ruth Namey. Especially because this lecture is hosted in Frankfurt, I acknowledge a third German scholarly giant, Max Weber, the single main shaper of my sociology. As a young student in the heartland of America, half a world away from Weber's haunt in Heidelberg, I read his twin essays, Science as a Vocation and Politics as a Vocation, and learned from him the importance of this distinction. I have followed a Weberian wissenschaftliche path in my work, as distinct from a Marxist or otherwise activist path, the path of social justice crusaders. I have tried to be a scientist of mobbing as an identifiable fact of life. My purpose is not to denounce or lament it, though it generally does more harm than good. My calling is not to moralize or ask people to play nice. I am not a preacher of political correctness. My aim is to shed light where there is usually lots of heat, to shed the light of reason, discipline, empirical analysis on a strange, exceptional, destructive thing we humans sometimes do, namely gang up on a fellow human and subject this target to intense collective hostility, besmirching the target's good name, shunning and punishing him or her, toward the end of forcing the target out of the workplace at hand. That is what I want to talk about with you. Now, whoever would stand on the shoulders of giants runs the risk of falling off and seeing not more than they did, but less. To keep your balance, you need colleagues. Smart fellow researchers who encourage your work, criticize it, add to it. The slide shows the names and locations of a dozen such colleagues. My website names dozens more. I live with my closest colleague, my wife Anne, a social planning professor. One summer day in 1994, she came home from the university carrying an article about psychological terror in workplaces by Heinz Lima. I'd never heard of him. You have to read this, she said. The effect of that article on me was a little like what happened to Paul when lightning struck him on his way to Damascus. The important point here is that I'm a little bit of an original, but mostly a voice for a loose, diverse community of scholars scattered across time and space, joined by effort to make scientific sense of one of the stranger social processes we humans enact. As illustration, I want to recount to you one case of academic mobbing, that of a neuroscientist at McGill University in Montreal in the early 1990s. Her story begins earlier, in the 1950s, when a globally renowned psychiatrist, Ewan Cameron, headed a large research program at McGill for understanding and curing the severely mentally ill, especially schizophrenics. He was, at the time, a superstar. His patients worshipped him. He set himself the quixotic task of figuring out how to straighten screwed up human heads, the objective of his experiments. Using electroshock therapy, drugs like LSD and curare, sleep deprivation, an incessant repetition of messages during induced sleep, what he calls psychic driving, he aimed to clear out bad stuff from a patient's mind and install good stuff. Now, Cameron died in 1967. His reputation has been going downhill ever since. A BBC documentary about him came out last year, 2020, entitled Eminent Monsters. What happened to Cameron was basically the cultural revolution that swept the Western world in the 1960s. That decade was the turning point toward postmodernity, a basic inversion of values. Distrust of authority and upending of established hierarchies are hallmarks of this era, which we are still living in. A delicious predilection is exposure of powerful people as abusers of powerless, vulnerable, oppressed, innocent victims. Men as abusers of women. Whites as abusers of people of color. Settlers of European origin as abusers of indigenous minorities. Cisgendered heterosexuals as abusers of gay and trans people. Priests as abusers of parishioners. Physicians as abusers of patients. Professors as abusers of students. And researchers as abusers of their subjects, research subjects. As Aaron mentioned, Paul Weindling's inaugural lecture in this series 6 years ago reflected this cultural priority in its condemnation of Julius Hallervorden and similar neuroscientists who built illustrious research careers by dissecting and studying brains harvested from children killed in the Nazi government's euthanasia program. Now, Ewan Cameron was not in Hallervorden's league of immorality. Cameron's patients were not held against their will, and he genuinely tried to help them get well. He was not a Nazi. He had examined Rudolf Hess at Nuremberg, strongly condemned Nazism, and was in fact bigoted against the German people in general. He was full of the hubris of Allied victory in World War II, overconfident in psychiatrists' abilities. His theories were no stranger than others at the time. Even so, once the news came out after Cameron's death that his research had been financially supported by the American CIA in the hope it would yield practical techniques of brainwashing, Cameron lost all respect. Through class action lawsuits in the 1980s, about 100 of his former patients won financial compensation from the CIA and the Canadian government. A further outcome of the Cameron scandal and of similar instances of real or imagined abuse of research subjects by powerful scientists was the creation of research ethics committees at McGill and other universities. You know better than I the guidelines of the Max Planck Society for committees on research ethics for protection of the vulnerable. Researchers now take it for granted that they must get ethics clearance before submitting applications for grants to study human subjects, who are now generally called participants. We humans are a complicated lot. Hypervigilance against one kind of harm invites other kinds of harm. There are subtler, sneakier ways of doing harm than cooperating with killers of innocent children or subjecting patients' minds to far-fetched experiments. Indeed, A high-minded ethics policy can be a tool of evil, a nonviolent weapon for destroying a colleague's career and life. One of my books includes an excellent essay by Canadian psychologist John Mueller entitled Research Ethics, a New Tool for Harassment in the Academic Workplace. Enter the psychologist Justine Sergeant. Born Justine Saad in Lebanon in 1950, she worked there as a teacher until meeting and marrying Yves Sergeant, a psychologist visiting from France. The couple moved to Montreal, where Justine earned 3 degrees at McGill, including a PhD in neuropsychology. Then she won a faculty position at the Montreal Neurological Institute, published articles in leading journals like Science, Nature, Brain. A colleague described her as an authentic scientist, smart, broad-minded, gentle, sensitive, delicate, passionate, a woman with a burning desire to know how the brain works, in particular, what happens in face recognition and in making music. Trouble was, Sergeant had enemies in her workplace. In July of 1992, one or another of them made an anonymous complaint against her for having failed to get ethics committee approval for her research on the brain function of pianists. Such approval was important because her experimental procedures involved positron emission tomography, that is PET scans, of the patient's brains. Sergeant experienced the charges against her as an attack on her worth as a scientist and as a person. She said she had made at most a technical mistake, that the Research Ethics Committee had approved the experimental treatment for her project on face recognition, an approval she understood to apply to her project with pianists. The procedure had been exactly the same. Her experimental subjects were never in danger. They had given their informed consent. In her view, she was not just innocent, she was doing what a first-rate scientist is supposed to do. A hypervigilant investigation, haunted by the memory of people like you and Cameron, found to the contrary. In January of 1993, McGill principal David Johnston gave Sergeant an official reprimand for academic misconduct. A professor less personally invested in her work might have laughed off this slap on the wrist. But not Sergeant. She took it as a personal smear, which her detractors undoubtedly intended. And she therefore appealed the reprimand to an arbitrator according to university policy. Now, you probably know all about arbitrations, as arbitrations usually do. This one lasted many months. And in the midst of it, somebody circulated a further anonymous letter, this one reporting publicly the university's official finding of guilt and Principal Johnston's reprimand. The letter suggested that Sergeant was not just unethical, but a scientific fraud. This letter arrived at the Gazette, Montreal's main English language newspaper. Now, a professor being reprimanded is not normally newsworthy, but in the postmodern cultural climate, with memories fresh of you and Cameron and other alleged abusers of researchers' power, the Gazette ran with the story. Its edition of 9 April 1994 carried a 600-word report headlined, Researcher Disciplined by McGill for Breaking Rules. The next day, Sergeant wrote a long letter describing the nightmare and harassment of the past 2 years. She said there was no end in sight now that it was exposed in a newspaper and blown out of proportion. She said it allows a discredit on myself, my work, and my career, which I cannot tolerate. I love research too much to even consider tampering with data, making false claims. And anyone working in my research field or participating in my experiments could testify that I have always paid much attention to the quality and rigor of my studies and to the welfare of subjects or patients participating in them. Her letter concluded, I had a rich and intense life, but there comes a point when one can no longer fight and one needs a rest. It is this rest, my husband, who has supported me in all aspects of my activities in my life, and myself have decided to take. Justine and Yves Sergeant were found dead in their car, the garage of their home on 12 April 1994. They had run a hose from the exhaust pipe to the passenger compartment. The car's motor was still running. On news of the suicides, which attracted much public interest, Principal Johnston said that the investigation into possible scientific fraud in Sergeant's work would continue. The results will be released when it is completed within the next 2 or 3 months. There was also to be a second investigation into the university's disciplinary procedures. Then, however, disputes arose about the terms of reference and who would do the investigating. Professors lawyered up, as you can imagine. 3 years after Justine and Yves Sergeant died, no reports had yet been issued. Johnston's successor as principal of McGill, Bernard Shapiro, shut the investigations down. The Gazette summed up the situation. This means all official inquiries into the matter have been canceled without any public light being shed on Sergeant's death or research. Now, before discussing the conceptual foundation of academic lobbying and key findings, I want to make 8 general points in relation to the case of Justine Sergeant. First, the mob may be small or large. There may be 100 professors and students denouncing the target at a mass protest, or thousands of signatures on a change.org petition demanding the target's ouster. Against Sergeant, there were just a handful of colleagues zealous to discredit and get rid of her, skillfully using McGill's research ethics policy toward that end. Second, successful mobbings hinge on some value that is salient in the context at hand, a value the target is accused of transgressing. For most of Western history, heterosexuality was so salient that calling someone a homosexual, falsely or not, was an effective way of disgracing him or her. Labeling another fascist or capitalist served well in Stalinist Russia. So did the label of communist in 1950s America. In most Western universities today, denouncing a prominent scientist like Sergeant as a power abuser and fraud resonates with the postmodern temper of our time, wherein protecting the lower downs from abuse by higher ups is the preeminent value. Now, third, even key participants in the typical academic mob may feel no ill will toward the target. They are bureaucrats in Max Weber's sense of the term, loyal to the institution, just going by the book, doing their jobs. Bernard Shapiro, the principal who let the deaths of Justine and Yves Sergeant recede into history with no institutional report on the lessons that might be learned, went on to become the Ethics Commissioner of Canada, our Parliament's highest authority on right and wrong. David Johnston, the principal who gave Justine the official reprimand, went on to become the president of my university, Waterloo. Then in 2010, Queen Elizabeth appointed Johnston Governor General of Canada. In effect, our head of state, the counterpart to the president of Germany. Johnston was humble, dutiful, hardworking, and successful in that job. Fourth lesson from the Sergeant case. Anonymous accusations are a poison useful to academic mobs, since they lessen the power of the accused and shield the accusers from accountability. After Sergeant's death, a group of McGill professors published a letter expressing their, quote, revulsion at the writing of an anonymous letter as a means of putting allegations into the public sphere. Fifth lesson. Professors most vulnerable to being mobbed are those unlike the majority of their colleagues in an elemental way: sex, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, age, language, credentials. Sergeant was a female Middle Eastern immigrant with degrees in psychology in an academic unit where the majority of professors were male, mainstream Canadians with degrees in medicine. None of these factors guaranteed that she would be mobbed, but they defined her as an outsider on whom ganging up was more likely. Professors who speak the vernacular with accents that distinguish them from native speakers are more likely to be mobbed. I do not know for sure, but I suspect that Sergeant's Lebanese upbringing showed when she spoke English or French. Sixth, suicide is not a part of mobbing, just one possible consequence of being mobbed. The collective action against Justine Sergeant would have been just as real if it had pushed her into chronic depression, caused her to have a stroke, turned her into a drug addict or alcoholic, or led to her lashing back in a violent counterattack. The statistically most common outcome of mobbing is that the target quits and finds a job elsewhere. Humans respond differently to humiliation, of which mobbing is an extreme form, and suicide an exceptionally sad consequence. Heinz Lima reported that about 15% of suicides in Sweden are traceable to being mobbed at work. Seventh lesson. Mobbing tends to have its most devastating effect on targets whose identities are overwhelmingly invested in a single workplace. McGill was very much Justine Sergeant's world. Her entire academic biography in Canada was in this one institution. Further, she and Eve had no children, and I suspect few, if any, relatives in Canada. In her case, the outside affiliations, attachments, and social supports that buffer the pain of workplace conflict were few and weak. Eighth and finally, suicide implies neither guilt nor innocence of an offense. Sergeant was almost surely not guilty of anything. If she had been guilty of something, you can be damn sure McGill would have publicized the evidence. Now, in a different mobbing case, one in which I declined to serve as expert witness, the target was a university president, clearly guilty of embezzling $1 million. She also killed herself. As an outcome of academic mobbing, suicide means only that the target can no longer endure the pain of collective opprobrium. Whether the opprobrium is deserved or not is a separate question. The same point applies, by the way, to homicide. Some mass campus shootings can be traced to the shooter being falsely accused and mobbed, while others have altogether different origins. Now, Anybody hearing the story of Justine Sergeant or any of dozens of similar stories in my files feels sadness that her life came to such an early tragic end. But as I said at the start, a scientist's job is not to lament sad events, but shed light on them through reasoned empirical analysis. You wouldn't think pursuing a science of mobbing is as hard as it actually is. As a farm boy whose chores included feeding the chickens, I saw firsthand the avian mobbing that Lorenz wrote about. Sometimes the hens would gang up and peck to death one of their number, often a new bird introduced into the flock. Or loud, incessant cackling has sometimes drawn my attention here in Canada. Crows mobbing an owl, one after another swooping down on it to land a blow. We've all seen videos online of teenagers whose instincts to gang up and to destroy have been aroused at once, and who then pounce in frenetic, violent attack on some target. How hard can it be to focus on similar collective aggression in academic workplaces? For this usually non-violent form of mobbing among adult humans, I made a checklist of indicators 20 years ago that has been widely used. The terms include, there's the list, barrage of hostile words and actions toward the target, secret meeting to decide what to do about him or her, statement with many signatures condemning the target, personal smears on the target, as opposed to issue-specific criticism, stigmatizing exclusionary labels placed on the target, labels like abuser, bully, racist, disregard for established procedures, urgent ad hoc action, apart from routine performance review. You get the drift. It's just a matter of conceptualizing clearly the object of study, measuring it empirically, studying case after case, and thinking up explanatory hypotheses. This is harder than it ought to be. The same postmodern mentality, the hunt for abusers of power, that inspires many academic mobbing cases in our time, has penetrated the human sciences, shifting their priority away from searching for empirical truth toward campaigning for social justice. These sciences, as everybody knows, have been politicized. Mobbing is deplored when the target is somebody in a less powerful category, female, person of color, gay, student, and the mobbers are mainly in a more powerful category, male, white, straight, professors. But mobbing is excused when the target is in a more powerful category, somebody who needs to be cut down to size. It's then just a matter of leveling the playing field. Mobbing is what it is, no matter who is the target or who are perpetrators. This is a hard point to get across. First lecture I gave about mobbing was in a colloquium in 1994 at Western University in Ontario. The most memorable response came from a colleague, personal friend of mine, prominent leftist sociologist and champion of the working class. Ken, he objected, what else are you going to do with rape busters, strike breakers, and scabs? Recall that Max Weber made the distinction, a sharp distinction, perhaps too sharp, between the scientific and political vocations. At Washington University in St. Louis in the 1960s, Alvin Goldner held a prestigious chair in sociology named for Weber because Weber had lectured there in 1904. Goldner was brilliant, bold, volcanic. In 1964, just at the beginning of the postmodern era, he published a famous article criticizing Weber's idea of a value-free sociology. Weber argued sociology can never be pure, objective science, that it is always somehow rooted in its social context. I read that article as a graduate student and liked it. Now, in 1967, 3 years later, with America sunk in the culture war, a younger scholar named Howard Becker went a step further, publishing a no less famous article, Whose Side Are We On? Implicitly, He urged the side of those with less power, the underdogs. Now, in Goldner's view, this was a step too far. Goldner published a harsh rebuttal, arguing that if side-taking or partisanship is the name of the game, there is no science, arguing against alliance with any faction and calling instead for self-reflection and self-examination in the midst of studying subject matters of whatever kind. Now, Goldner died young in 1980. Becker has outlived him by 40 years, and Becker's activist, radically social constructionist, politicized approach has won the day. Indeed, won the past half century. One of Becker's mantras is a quote from comedian Lily Tomlin: "Reality is nothing but a collective hunch." Sociology and related fields are by now widely and accurately understood as instruments for social justice, bodies of knowledge created to level hierarchies, to defend the good guys from the bad guys, the people on the bottom from the people on top. The project of science, explanation, and understanding has been largely displaced by the postmodern project of social reform. The battle against, you know the list: racism, sexism, classism, ageism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, harassment, bullying. In this cultural context, doing science is hard. Here's an example. In 2019, the Swiss magazine Republik asked me to look at documentation on a dismissal case at ETH Zurich, the case of astronomy professor Marcella Carollo, and comment on it from the viewpoint of the mobbing research. I declined most such requests for lack of time, but I couldn't pass this one up. Switzerland is known for moderation. ETH Zurich is a serious, science-minded school, kind of like a Max Planck Institute. This was its first ever dismissal case, and the eliminated professor was a woman, a member of the traditionally subordinate sex that in postmodern culture is supposed to have an edge. From Googling her name, I got the impression Carollo is a first-rate scientist, a high achiever, active, demanding, well-published, devoted to her work. She did not even seem eccentric or odd. As all of you academics know, universities routinely make allowance for smart but strange intellectuals. A PhD often comes with OCD, ADHD, depression, a little autism, some kind of quirk. Remember the great film, A Beautiful Mind, about Princeton mathematician John Nash? Or think of Avital Ronell, the Germanistics professor at New York University who has kept her job, despite famously abusing her students sexually and otherwise. Carollo, by contrast, seems pleasant and sensible. Having pitted the Carollo evidence against my standard checklist of indicators, I concluded that she had indeed been mobbed, run out of her job by a band of zealots from inside and outside her university. The case seemed to me to represent a confluence of traditional prejudice against women, the minority sex in the field, and postmodern pandering to self-described victims. Carollo had found the work of one of her students unsatisfactory, a female student, who thus scored higher on the postmodern scale of oppression than her female professor. Carollo had allegedly told the student to spend less time on makeup and more on research. I was pleased that Republik publicly brought the mobbing research to bear on public discussion of Carollo's dismissal. On a news story about a subsequent stage of the ongoing saga, the news aggregator World News put this headline: "Gemobbte Professorin erhebt neue Vorwürfe." Mobbed professor raises new allegations. Yet there's no escaping the postmodern muddle. On the very same news story, the magazine Schweiz am Wochenende put the exact opposite headline. Mobbende Professorin erhebt neue Vorwürfe. Mobbing professor raises new allegations. So which is it? Is Carollo gemobbte or mobbende? Mobbed or mobbing? The one abused or the abuser? Does it all depend on whose side you are on? What Howard Becker proposed in 1967? Is it just a matter of what is our collective hunch, as Lily Tomlin put it? Is this what discourse comes down to? No. The requirements of reason have not changed. Clear meaning of words, logic, evidence. Carollo cannot mob anybody. It's linguistically impossible. The word means collective attack, like crows tormenting an owl. Carollo can bully, chicaneer, or harass, belästigen, though I saw no evidence of this. But it is no more possible for her as one individual human to mob another than it is for a man to get pregnant. That happens only in an alternative universe, the postmodern wonderland. These times may not be auspicious, but research on mobbing has progressed. The literature has burgeoned. Dozens of new articles are published every month. Just this summer, the Beiträge zur Hochschulforschung published thoughtful, insightful analysis by the Austrian scholars Heike Egner and Anke Uhlenwinkel of 20 recent cases of apparent academic mobbing, mostly of female professors in German-speaking universities. By now, we can speak of an ongoing research tradition. I should add that academic mobbing, though not always by this name, is increasingly recognized in public culture. My website lists dozens of films and novels. Here, let me recommend just one new, true-to-life dramatic depiction of today's university. I hope many of you have seen it. The 6-episode miniseries released on Netflix last month, The Chair, starring the Canadian Sandra Oh as the newly appointed head of an English department at an elite American university. On today's campus, all it takes is one little soundbite, one tweet, one screen capture to set off a mob bent on getting rid of some allegedly unfit professor. In this Netflix series, the chair's colleague and intimate friend makes the Nazi salute in jest during a lecture. It's captured on students' cell phones, goes viral on social media. Students demand his ouster. Administrators acquiesce. The plot follows what actually happened at a school in New York in 2018. The slide shows the hapless professor, the poor bastard, trying in vain to reason with his fanatic adversaries. Before summarizing a few more research findings, let me highlight the importance of the word mobbing itself. In this specialty, as in any other, the foundational concept makes all the difference. Having the word mobbing in your vocabulary lets you recognize and bring into focus an array of strange but momentous happenings in your everyday working life that would otherwise be a confusing blur. In the appreciative emails I've received from academics around the world, the single main thing they've thanked me for is giving them a label, a name, for a cluster of hostile words and actions, from name-calling, invective, eye-rolling, and shunning, to censure, exclusion, dismissal, whose interrelatedness might otherwise escape notice. So that's what it's called. One African-American professor in the United States began her email to me. In an email just last week, a male physics professor in Canada said something I've heard many times. I had no idea this was so common. I always thought it was just me. How much less we would understand of life if we did not have in our vocabularies the concept of falling in love. This too is a strange, momentous phenomenon, nonetheless a fact of life. It too is rooted in instincts, sexual attraction, pair bonding. that we humans share with most birds and some animals. The Italian sociologist Francesco Alberoni has done a great service by elucidating what falling in love means empirically, and it should be an Italian sociologist who would do that. He describes it as the arousal of intense attraction between two people, such that they form a little social movement for going through life together rather than separately. Now, mobbing is also a kind of social movement, in this case, rooted in shared fanatic aversion for somebody, and in collective action toward humiliating this target, making the target's life a burden, cutting him or her out of the circle of respectability, and in the long run, eliminating this person from the workplace. As Alberoni has done in the case of falling in love, mobbing researchers contribute to the public good by expounding upon what mobbing means. Basic question about any phenomenon is incidence. Mobbing is a rare, but how rare depends on how strictly it is measured. Lehman estimated that fewer than 5% of workers are mobbed sometime in their careers. This figure seems about right for academia. In the normal course of events, a professor's stock rises and falls over time. The prof wins an honor this year, is passed over next year. Citations increase steadily for a while, then taper off. That's not mobbing, that's life. Mobbing is when the professor's stock crashes, tanks, to the point that nobody wants even one share of it, or even to admit knowing that professor's name. Public versus private sector, whether measured strictly or loosely, mobbing is more common in the public sector, universities, hospitals, public services, than in private corporations. A company that squanders its resources on internal bickering tends to lose out in a competitive market to well-managed companies that mobilize resources toward producing saleable commodities. Publicly funded institutions, by contrast, insulated from accountability by layers of bureaucracy and political interests, can survive for years while producing little of much good to anyone. A related finding is that mobbing is more common where workers have a fair bit of job security, like tenure in universities, union contracts, rules that allow dismissal only for cause. In the private sector workplaces where at-will contracts are the norm, a disliked worker can be abruptly fired, rightly or wrongly, and that's the end of it. By contrast, in workplaces where job protections are the norm, a disliked worker who looks good on paper and is by all the evidence productive and competent is more often gotten rid of by mobbing, subjecting this person to months and years of petty harassment, shunning, accusation, endless series of hostile acts that wear the target down, force him or her to quit, go on long-term disability, or die. Any number of qualities in a worker can trigger hostile collective action from workmates. I've already mentioned minority status on some elemental dimension. Another common trigger is showing workers up, intentionally or not, by publications, honors, popularity with students. Envy is a powerful force in human affairs. The title of my main book on academic mobbing is The Envy of Excellence. Low achievers do not seem especially likely to be mobbed. Often they are tolerated since they make workmates look good. The professor most likely to be mobbed is the one who makes colleagues look bad, the one who reminds them of their own inadequacies. A bright light, so the saying goes, casts a strong shadow. Or to use a Japanese metaphor, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. In both academic and non-academic workplaces, a good rule to keep from being mobbed is variously phrased: go along to get along. Don't make waves. Keep your head down. Don't stick your neck out. Few, if any, of the mobbing targets I've studied have followed this rule. They have shown more loyalty to principals than to their colleagues and the local administrators. Higher loyalties often turn a professor or any worker into a whistleblower or a critic of management, somebody who smiles, or what is worse, laughs at the self-promoting, self-congratulatory, but unfounded superlatives with which people and institutions these days tend to describe themselves. Now, in conclusion, you've hung with this long lecture a long time. It's almost done. I want to encourage brain researchers to join the multidisciplinary quest for scientific understanding of mobbing in academic and other workplaces. Scholars from many disciplines, psychology, law, philosophy, so on, are contributing. Each discipline sheds light on mobbing from its own angle. The neuroscientific angle is an important one. I know precious little about it, but I know scholars in your field have detected physical evidence in the brain associated with human emotions like empathy, compassion, altruism, and envy. Tanya Zinger, a Max Planck neuroscientist, is well known for demonstrating connections between what happens in the brain and what happens in everyday social relations. Israeli researcher Inbal Ben-Ami Bartal and her colleagues published a paper just this summer on the neurocorrelates of in-group bias in rats. Besides documenting that a rat is more likely to come to the aid of a close relative than a distant one, these researchers have shown the different things that happen in a rat's brain at the sight and sound of another rat in distress, depending on how close is its genetic relation to that other rat. That's exciting kind of research. It prompts me to beg neuroscientists to find out what happens in the brains of normal men and women when their instincts to gang up and to destroy are aroused. That is, when they form a workplace mob. Can you tell from neural patterns which colleagues a professor feels compassion for, or which ones elicit envy? What happens in professors' brains when they meet secretly with one another to plot against their target? What happens inside a normal professor's brain when he or she endures for months or years on end the visceral dislike of nearly all co-workers along the corridor? These are empirical questions, answerable through scientific procedures that you know how to use, but that practitioners like me of other disciplines do not. So I want to leave you neuroscientists with the same invitation and challenge I have held out to colleagues in other disciplines, namely to use your particular subject matter, concepts, theories, and methodological techniques to enlarge our understanding of the momentous social process called mobbing. If I can paraphrase the pungent quote attributed to Marcella Carollo, spend less time engaging in mobbing and more time producing scientific knowledge about it. That would be, in my judgment, supremely ethical work. Thanks to all of you, and I welcome your feedback.
Thank you very